to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. My name is Leigh Johnson, and unusually, I am joined only by my co-host, Devonya Havis today. Unfortunately, Rick is not with us, but we do have a very special guest, and we'll introduce him in just a little bit. And we're going to be talking about DEI then and now. But before we get into that, let's get some drink orders and some rants or raves. So, Devonya, what are you drinking?
Today, I'm going to have a blackberry lime porch punch. Porch sitting in this winter wonderland is not a thing I get to do right now. So the idea of blackberry, lime juice, a little bit of ginger beer, and my favorite is a Southerner sweet tea sounds entirely enjoyable in this moment.
As someone who's also from the South, let me just say, for those of you who don't know, that sweet tea is tongue-curling sweet tea.
Indeed it is. And when I came north and started getting tea with no sugar, my friends are like, I'm revoking your Southerner card. It's a sad thing. So I'm taking it back with this sweet tea addition to my mocktail. Today, I am raving about Miles Davis's Sketches of Spain. It's a combination of jazz with Spanish influences, and it's something that was motivating for me in graduate school when I would do my long coffee shop sits in an attempt to read and write. It is a nice, mellow kind of calm with just enough creativity to keep things interesting. So check it out if you get a chance.
Perfect. And I see that you have our special guest sitting next to you. Do you want to introduce him?
Oh, I'd love to. I'm so excited to have history professor emeritus at Boston College, Paul Breines. Paul has taught courses in modern European intellectual and cultural history with a particular interest in Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. He is author and co-author of 2 books, Tough Jews, Political Fantasies, and the Moral Dilemma of American Jewry, and his co-authored book, The Young Lukács and the Origins of Western Marxism. I am so excited to have Paul here, not only because of his amazing intellectual acumen and engagement, but also because Paul was a freedom rider of 1961 in what my elders called the Black Freedom Movement, or just the movement. He has continued these kinds of battles around LGBTQ plus rights. And so I'm very excited to engage with Paul today. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Devonya, very much. I'm honored to be here, and I'm especially honored and humbled by the things that you said about me. My drink is a bitter melon tea with a shot of any vodka.
Love those well drinks.
Because we do need some shots now.
I think so. It's the time of day. It's 3:54. I am going to rave on you, Devonya, and the article that you've written, The Debility of Terrorism and the Ethics of Resistance. I was fortunate enough to read a manuscript of this article, which is for a volume edited by George Yancey and Todd Franklin of essays by Black philosophers reflecting on the open casket of Emmett Till's body and Devonya's interpretation of maybe Till Mosley's decision to have the open casket. I thought quite brilliant, and I encourage everybody to check this book out when it comes out.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks so much. And Leigh, what are you having?
Well, I'm just going to have 2 fingers of Buffalo Trace on the rocks, and I am raving today about Roberta Flack. So as we are recording this, unfortunately, we just learned of Roberta Flack's passing, an amazing musical artist, and this has given me pause to go back and listen to a lot of her works. In particular, I want to draw people's attention to her probably most famous track, Killing Me Softly. And if you're of my generation, you can't hear that track without also hearing the Fugees saying, one time, as she says, killing me softly. And I want to remind everyone, or maybe let everyone know, if you don't already know, that this song is actually about a time that Roberta Flack sat and watched Don McLean perform his song Vincent, which is about Vincent van Gogh. There's a lot of things to recommend here, not only a chance to go back and listen to Roberta Flack, but also to check out Don McLean. And while you're at it, check out some of Vincent van Gogh. These are three amazing artists. Roberta Flack, you were an absolute legend. So, Devonya, I know that we are talking about DEI then and now, and I'm so excited about having Paul with us here today. But how did you imagine this conversation going?
I have been looking at the current moment and observing an active assault on DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. This framework is not fully defined. However, the 1960s activism and its attempts to alter a status quo that was patently segregationist and exclusionary, it seems to me that there is a relevancy now with that moment then. I really want to think about the then and the now. I want to think about the activism oriented toward changing the status quo to be more inclusive. But I also want to think about the kind of activism that has led to recent executive orders with such titles as ending radical indoctrination in K through 12 schools, ending illegal discrimination, and restoring merit-based opportunity. The way in which these things are framing DEIA as if somehow people who are diverse, people who require accessibility, are not also people who merit inclusion in these institutions. And I thought it would be terrific to talk with Paul, who is someone who is motivated not only to think about these things, as he does in his work on radicalism, European intellectual tradition, and American intellectual traditions, but also he was motivated to take to the streets. And my overwhelming question is this a moment calling for a kind of activism that we haven't seen in quite some time?
We've ended the tyranny of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion policies all across the entire federal government and indeed the private sector and our military. And our country will be woke no longer.
So glad to have you with us today. I feel really honored by the fact that you're joining us here at the bar. I want to start off with kind of a cluster of questions, and I hope this is not too overwhelming, and you can pick whichever one you want to answer. But I know, and our listeners know, that you came of age in the 1960s. You were one of the freedom riders, and that was a period of profound political upheaval and civil rights activism. There's been a lot of debate recently about whether the U.S. is experiencing a second Reconstruction or a second redemption. And I suppose what I want to ask you is a number of things. Like, what are the key similarities and differences that you see between that era and today's struggles for social justice? Are there particular things that you think contemporary activists and scholars misunderstand about the legacy of the civil rights movement? And maybe most importantly, do you think that we're now currently in a period of progress, backlash, or something entirely different?
Wow. No, I said wow because those are huge and wonderful questions. They're probably the questions that all of the folks listening to this discussion would have. In fact, they're questions that I have. I think about this all the time. That's why I'm losing sleep and all of that. My thought about is there activism needed now is yes, with about 5,000 exclamation points.
Amen.
More than that, not just yes, but there are forms of activism that will emerge from Trump, against Trump, that we can't quite imagine yet. One of those forms of action, for example, is the resignations of some of the people on Trump's team.
Yeah.
I don't forgive them for being Trump supporters, but the fact that they're saying like, oh, wait a minute, I draw a line here. I see that as a kind of activism which the weirdness of the present moment lets us see.
Yeah.
One of the things that the Trump phenomenon has done is create spaces for all of us to experience uncertainty, along with fear, along with rage. But a lot of the ideological and intellectual constructs that we did our politics and activism with don't quite work in the same way because we haven't kept abreast of certain changes. Devonya said something that really set off a thought in my mind. It would take a longer time to fill in the blanks, but the MAGA phenomenon is part of a huge reaction by white Americans, particularly in the South, but nationally as well, to the gains of the early 60s civil rights movement, which I was one tiny little participant in the Freedom Rides of 1961. Which culminated in the Voter Registration Act and the Voting Rights Act illegalizing segregation in education.
Right.
Trumpism via Reaganism, via Goldwaterism in 1964. This is a long-range reaction, an attempt to reassert something that large numbers of Americans, white Americans, feel was lost, that has been taken away from them.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the civil rights movement in the 60s. Late 1960s, women begin to say, hey, why are we always washing dishes in the movement office?
Right.
What's going on here?
Oh, they were saying that before the 60s.
They were saying that before the 60s, but there was a quantity change that made for something different. Large numbers of women said, yeah, what the hell is going on here? Like, we don't tolerate this. It's over. And feminism emerged. And then the cops stormed the Stonewall Tavern in Greenwich Village. And the queens and the queers said, no, you can't do this to us. We're fighting back. We're not taking it anymore. And there's gay liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's Asian American rights, the rights of disabled people. What we've seen is Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott and slaves who said no during the Middle Passage. All of that was inspiring to people, so that when disabled people began to say, hey, what about us? You know, like, you think it's normal to have a sidewalk like this. Well, we're here to tell you it's not. We see the world differently, and we're asking that you see the world through our eyes.
Right.
Which is what the Black movement was also saying. We see the world as Black people differently from you all, white people. You got to start learning this.
And what I find interesting about your example of sidewalks is that there comes to be an affinity between disabled people who want different kinds of sidewalks, in particular curb cuts, and moms who are pushing strollers. When we began to look at the world in different ways, there are different forms of solidarity that emerge where there is an interest convergence that people can motivate around.
For sure.
I was going to transition into another kind of question for Paul, who I know has thought and written much about intellectual history of radicalism, because we are a bunch of philosophers at the bar. I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how you see philosophy and theory playing a role in motivating some of this activism, not simply as an analytic lens, but how have you experienced philosophy kind of out in the wild?
That's also a great question, which provokes me to reflect just very quickly on how interesting it is for any of us, I would assume, how we saw the world when we were 20 years old, which is what I was in 1961. I was a college sophomore at the University of Wisconsin. What changed my life was a course taught by George L. Mossey, an intellectual cultural history course, and he's written on Nazism and lots of things, and was my mentor. I took his course in European intellectual history from like the French Revolution to the then present, 1959. And it happened that in that course, he mentioned Immanuel Kant. When I was in Nashville, Tennessee, in late July of 1961 at the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee office, which was where our training center was, I had my first taste of collard greens and grits, and I had my first experience inside a Black church. And one of the mass meetings that I went to in the neighborhood Baptist church in Nashville, one of the activists in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Ivanhoe Donaldson, who must have been a philosophy graduate student or a philosophy major, he yells out at this church congregation. He says, "Do you know what we're doing? we are carrying out a moral action. Do you know what a moral action is? And people
Bless
are saying,
him.
no, bring it. Let's hear it. What's a moral? He says, a moral action is an action which you undertake in the conviction that if everybody undertakes that same action, the world will be a better place. This was his interpretation of Kant's moral imperative.
Love it. I love
And he
it.
says, do you know who said that? And the silence. You think, oh, what the hell is going on? And he throws his fist in the air and he says, Immanuel Kant. And the whole congregation broke up. There wasn't a praise break, but there could have been. They were just elated. They were screaming and yelling, Immanuel Kant. So I said, thank God I know who Immanuel Kant was. I didn't know about theory in 1961. I was just beginning to get introduced. I read a biography by Isaiah Berlin of Karl Marx. So when I was in the SNCC Training Center, my education in theory for the civil rights movement was reading pamphlets by Gandhi and speeches by Dr. King. I read Letter from a Birmingham Jail. All the white freedom riders had experiences as children with anti-Black racism, which affected us deeply. It changed our lives. That is, it made us begin a process of saying, how would a Black person view this that I'm looking at as a white person? And the first thing you say is, there were quite a few million Black people. What Black person? Which Black person's eyes do I see this world through? So I was inspired by a number of Black role models as a child and as a teenager. And I had a mother who was kind of ideal anti-racist before that was even a term. She taught me about the N-word. She didn't want Black Sambo story in the elementary school that I attended. And
Right.
She argued with the librarians and stuff. So we were all inspired basically by Black people. What's happened is that what Black people did is still going on. It's going on in the adding of accessibility. That's the civil rights movement. That's that
Right.
energy that says, we're here, we're queer, get fucking used to it. And now all of us have had to say, oh, how would a person in a wheelchair view this situation? Why do people enjoy it when Trump abuses verbally people in wheelchairs and people with disabilities? They applaud it. I mean, we're in an astonishing situation. I'm depressed, but I'm also hopeful that there are going to be some astonishing surprises in forms of activism where you have mothers with carriages joining in an alliance with disabled people, fighting for a new curb cut. Who would have thunk it?
Paul, I want to come back just for a second to this question about the role of theory and activism, because I don't know if you share this or if Devonya, you also share this perspective, but I feel like I see many young people today, particularly young activists, are not only exhausted by the seemingly endless cycles of injustice and backlash, but particularly exhausted by the left's lazy reliance on their moral superiority and by the left's lazy reliance on theory. I know, Paul, you've written about the ways that the left has sometimes failed to effectively challenge reactionary politics. And we all remember that famous quote from Marx where he says, the weapon of criticism cannot, of course, replace criticism by weapon. How do you see these critiques fitting into the broader history of social justice movements? And more specifically, what missteps do you see happening today? And how might activists and scholars avoid repeating them? I suppose at core, what I'm asking you is to speak a little bit to what I see as a pronounced difference between the activist movement in the 60s, which was very motivated both by a kind of moral high ground and theory, and the frustration of activists today who see that what I was calling a lazy reliance on theory or the moral high ground is just not getting us anywhere.
I know what you mean by the sort of leftist sensibility. Because we have theory, which comes from Hegel, we know what's up. We know what's happening. We are the advanced guard intellectually and mentally. And there's also in some of that a moralizing presupposition. We are the righteous ones. That's a very interesting and important topic. The results of it are disastrous. They're only helpful for leftists who want to stay on the margins of things. I can't believe I'm saying this, because if you would ask me this question 30 years ago, I would have said, Well, from a Marxist standpoint, you have to look
Yeah,
at the larger
right.
structure, and that's not how the civil rights movement started. I mean, going back to the slave who said no in the Middle Passage, and I'm sure there were many of them, to Rosa Parks, to the 4 guys at North Carolina A&T who sat in at the lunch counter in Woolworths and Greensboro
Right.
and changed the world. Just these 4 guys who were sitting in their room like they were having a discussion, probably they probably weren't at a bar because they weren't of age, but they were having a discussion the way we are. And when somebody later asked Franklin McCain, who was one of the 4, were you afraid when you sat in? And he said, I was too angry to be afraid. That's how
Wow.
social movements
Wow.
start.
Exactly.
And there are going to be people who are not on the left who are going to say tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Trump is going to do a lot of damage. There's no question about it. There's going to be things that are not fixable that he will do. But I think there will be activism that will emerge in ways that we need to take part in and be curious about and learn from and contribute to, make them what they should be.
And I'm hopeful about that kind of activism. And to Leigh's point, I'm also struck by the ways in which the framing of these initiatives to roll back what is being called DEIA are arguments around restoring justice.
Right.
It strikes me that the language and justifications that are being mobilized are historically the kinds of things that the left has used to argue for the moral high ground. So what do you do when each side is arguing that they are framing these things as a matter of justice? And I'm wondering if that is somewhat different than the 1960s. A lot of the arguments were about the maintenance of a particular kind of status quo in the 60s. We want to maintain segregation. It is, in the South, our way of doing things.
Right.
But in the North, there is a much more quiet form of segregation. So the movement in the South ran in a particular kind of way that didn't quite work in the North.
Right, absolutely. Not at all. One of the things that may have played a role in that absence, I worked for a summer in 1964 for an organization whose name was the Northern Student Movement. It was supposed to be the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the North. It was in Harlem. It was colossally unsuccessful. Can you imagine there? I would go with a black coworker and we would go to an apartment building on 138th Street and Amsterdam Avenue and knock on doors. We're from the Northern Student Movement. We're bringing social change to the ghetto. That was actually what we said.
Oh, my.
Yes, you're right. It did not succeed. One of the things that my experience in Nashville left me with in a very big way was that I don't remember the names of the people and I don't remember the homes in which I slept the 4 or 5 nights that I was in Nashville for training before I went off to Jackson. Somebody had to drive me, had to risk their life to pick me up at the bus station coming down from New York to take me to the SNCC office.
Wow.
It would be arranged by CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, that was coordinating things in the North. They were based also in Harlem. Nashville impressed me so much that it involved a mobilization of an entire community that worked through what was called a phone chain, which today somebody who's 15 probably had never heard of a phone chain, which was something where you had landlines that had wires. You had a list of all of your co-workers, all of the members of the same community, people who you worked with, who you knew. Things were not quite as fragmented. And women who cooked us dinner when we got out of prison risked their lives to do it. They could have been shot at by Klansmen who did shoot at the fraternal lodge where these meals were held.
Wow.
And also, one other piece of this, I hope I don't upset anybody with this, but not only was there no such thing as diversity, but I started to say something earlier. There was one kid, a guy probably my age, around 20 in 1961, who wanted to be a freedom rider, but his father was an Indonesian diplomat, and the police would not arrest him in Jackson. They turned him away. If you look at the book of mugshots of freedom riders, there's only white and black people. There is not an Asian face. There is not a South Asian face. There is not an Indian face, a Latinx, Hispanic, Latino, Latina face. There's just white people and black people. That's it. There was no diversity. There was justice and equality for people whose skin is darker than ours. That's all it is. Then there were women, black women and white women. Then there were gay people and lesbians and transsexuals and bisexuals. disabled people and Puerto Ricans and Koreans, et cetera, et cetera. Now, diversity, as I see it, having come out of the 1960s Black movement, diversity has meant that Black America is kind of put in this funny position in relation to lots of other minorities and lots of other people who in different ways are brutalized or dispossessed or mistreated. That is, I a little bit experienced some of the expansion of diversity as there's something not quite right about it. It somehow marched away from white racism and the whole phenomenon of slavery in our history and our present culture. That's being pushed aside. And I don't know what the alternative is. I don't mean to say everybody else should shut up until we solve the white problem in relation to Black people. But it's an issue.
Hey, Hotel Bar Session listeners, this is Rick Lee. Do you know what kind of pillow I use or mattress I sleep on? No, of course you don't. And that's because we don't have any of those stupid ads for pillows or mattresses or any other crap that you don't even want. We are supported by you, our listeners. And if you want to keep our late night conversations flowing, why not do the equivalent of buying us a drink or giving us a high five? You could subscribe to our podcast at Patreon. That's patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. And you could subscribe at many levels. And hey, there's perks at those levels. You could get a coffee mug, or I might even call you out on an episode, or you could get early access to some of our episodes. There are lots of perks there, and we could really use your help. So go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at any level you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, we'll see you back at the bar.
It strikes me that one of the things that's going on in the present moment is that we are thinking about diversity from the standpoint of institutions. And Paul talked about justice, especially justice around people who are racialized as non-white, and the ways in which whiteness meant that there was a demand for a certain kind of action. There was no language of DEI in the 60s, and increasingly that language has meant a particular kind of representation and institutionalization of diversity, but not necessarily in ways that force or demand that institutions change the perspectives from which they're operating. So it's an invitation to be included in business as usual, not necessarily an invitation for institutions to understand that range of consciousnesses that fundamentally alters the nature of the institution.
I think that really points to the limits of liberalism, classical liberalism. And this kind of gets back to what I was asking Paul before about positioning the activist mindset as if it's a matter of enlightenment or moral education. I don't think either of those things are bad things. I think those are good ways to go about activism, but they have been in some ways co-opted, and many mainstream DEI initiatives operate within corporate institutional structures that are ultimately invested in maintaining the status quo.
For sure.
And if we want to ask, how do we navigate the tension between incremental reform and radical change, then we really do have to go back and ask, what is the motivating impetus of activism right now? And I think that when we hear the constant refrain of people from the right who are talking about woke indoctrination and other kinds of bullshit, like that, they are figuring themselves weirdly as reactionary, as radicals, right? As people pushing forward a kind of liberal cause, classically liberal cause. And then, it just all becomes this weird muck, nonsensical morass where it's sort of hard to piece out, how do you even identify what side you're on?
I was struck when King's birthday became nationalized that everyone somehow was taking part in the civil rights movement. It was this expansion of the American dream, the flexibility of democracy and classical liberalism, that a civil rights movement could move democracy forward in these really interesting ways. I remember when Rosa Parks passed away and she was brought to the Congressional Rotunda, the America that firehose Snick and other young people demanding equitable rights was sort of like a dissociative moment where I'm like, are we both and?
Probably we are.
We definitely are both and. I mean, in my view, one of the problems now is that we don't so much live in a world in which people say, I am a racist.
I think that may have been more true 20 years ago.
I mean, I think the things that we used to not say out loud, people are saying out loud. But it's still the case that the majority of Americans presume that it's not okay to, for example, make a Nazi salute in front of a crowd of people, or to say, I am a racist, or I am a white supremacist. Not to say that there aren't people who are Nazis and white supremacists, but that it's still not entirely integrated into the social fabric, that is just something that people do. Whereas it was in the 60s, right? Like it wasn't weird for somebody to say, I'm a white supremacist. It wasn't weird for somebody to say, you people shouldn't be eating at the same lunch counters that I eat at, or riding the same buses that I ride, or drinking from the same water fountains that I drink at, or living in my neighborhood, or baking at my bank, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Like it was much more explicit. I think the problem now, though, is that what we're seeing increasingly is that those people who used to call themselves white supremacists are now calling themselves victims, like victims of racial discrimination. You know, we're in the upside down now. I mean, things are just, as Paul said earlier, weird. It's hard to parse out what things actually mean. You know, it's very hard for people to find a footing in activism because the same place that anti-racist activists find their footing is right beside the foot of racist activists.
Yeah.
So in other words, you've got both sides of activism calling out discrimination, but the terms by which they're defining it are radically different.
Exactly.
I'm struggling to find a good response to that issue. This is just kind of a semi-comedic interlude. I have this fear that whatever form the new activism takes, it's going to consist of people taking selfies. No, anything but that.
Do you mean by that there's a kind of solipsism to people's political sensibilities now? Is that what you're worried about?
To me, that's a very provocative question. I mean, I hadn't thought that far ahead. My friend Stuart Ewan is writing about selfies and individualism in high gear and what impact that has on society, and he was going to call it the century of the selfie. So yeah, I guess I do imply that kind of solipsism, but I also think it's pretty superficial and that people can break from it when they need to. That's my hope.
Mm-hmm.
But the phenomenon that Devonya was talking about, you know, by the time of the late 60s, everybody was against racism, and the civil rights movement did give racism a bad name. That was one of its achievements. You couldn't say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever.
Right.
If I said to somebody who was my age in 1960 in Birmingham, a white person, I said, well, you're a racist. Yeah, duh. Of course I'm a racist. I and all my friends are racist. The world I live in is racist.
Mm-hmm.
You know why? Because black people are inferior to us. That's why. Oh my God, you're a racist. I said, yes. The civil rights movement put an end to a large extent to that, except it kind of went underground and it's coming out now in Trumpism. It's coming back in some weird way. But the civil rights movement did give racism a bad name. You're exactly right, Leigh. People were hesitant to say by the time of the 1980s or 2010, I'm a racist.
But I think what I want to do is I want to contrast that with now when you look at the rhetoric against, for example, queer people or trans people in particular. Let's choose that. It's not that people say, I believe trans people are inferior. They transfer, ironically, the blame to trans people. So the argument against trans people is not, I believe trans people are inferior. The argument against trans people is, I believe they're lying to me. Like, I believe that they don't understand science. I believe that they are threatening because they're trying to, I don't know, sneak into the wrong bathrooms or whatever. Or I believe that they're pedophiles. But the argument is not, as the kind of old, proud racist argument goes, I believe I'm superior and other people are inferior. Now the discrimination happens in much, I think, ideologically different ways.
Yes, yes.
It sounds like you're talking a little bit of ideological contagion. If we take this seriously, it is threatening to a certain kind of order. Is that what you're getting at, Leigh?
I think part of it is that it's threatening to a certain kind of order, but so was integration. And people still said, I'm proudly a racist. But now I don't think people say, I'm proudly anti-trans. I think that people say trans people are wrong. Trans people are dangerous. Trans people are threatening. Trans people are undermining the core fabric of American moral sensibilities. So it's not me doing something as the anti-trans person or the anti-queer person or the racist.
But that to me sounds a lot like anti-Black rhetoric that one would hear, especially around integration in the South, that these are moral threats.
But bona fide racists said they ought not to be integrated because they're inferior. I don't think that you hear that today in anti-queer rhetoric or anti-trans rhetoric. I don't think that you hear trans people, queer people are inferior and I'm superior. I think what you hear is, I am under threat. I, the person who am anti-queer or anti-trans, I'm the one under threat. They're the aggressors. They're the ones that are doing something wrong.
That's a really perceptive observation. There's been a sort of inverse projection, reversal of things where it's as if because of the civil rights movement and because of another development that happened to be simultaneous with it, but with attention being paid in the United States to the Holocaust and this genocide of Jews by Hitler, the attempted genocide. In some sick way, it's as if by the 1970s or 80s, victim became cool. There was a kind of cultural evolution. And so it turns out that instead of saying, hey, as white people, as straight people, etc., we have to feel guilty because we've mistreated some other group. No, we're a victim too.
Yeah.
We're part of that cool group of victims, and we're going to fight like hell against our victimization. But I mean, it's a weird phenomenon. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm getting at. It is that exact weaponizing of what we used to call identity politics. Not used to call, because it is identity politics, but it's that exact weaponizing of identity politics that has smoothed the way, like paved the way for the right to so effectively attack DEIA programs. If they were saying, we are racists, we don't want diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility for human beings that are inferior to us, it would be much harder for like their peers, their soft, moderate peers to buy into that program. But instead, what they say is, no, we don't want diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility for people who are actually harmful, who are actually threatening us, right? Like it would be like saying, I'm not saying, I don't want queers in the university or with job protections or whatever because they are inferior. I don't want them to have those protections or that equitable, inclusive accessibility because they are actual threats. It would be like saying, yeah, we should have a DEI program for pedophiles, which is quite literally what they say when they're talking about queers.
Yes, yes.
Then that appeals to everybody, right? Because we're all like, okay, yeah, none of us want inclusion for pedophiles, right? Like, it's like that seems like a reasonable argument, I'm just saying it's been a very effective strategy.
And I think what you've laid out, Leigh, is really an article. I mean, you might put on your agenda.
I'm not taking homework assignments right now, but okay, no, I'm joking.
All right, but that should be laid out for people to read and think about.
I also wonder if you're describing the need to be protected from aggressors. A lot of that kind of logic is mobilized in the deployment of criminality and what and who one envisions as criminal. The criminal as a figure has been racialized, which then permissions a certain kind of set of encounters people take as normal.
That's exactly right. And I think that's the transition that we saw between basically the 60s and the 80s.
For sure.
Is that now racists don't say Black people are inferior. They say Black people are criminals, or Black people are drug addicts, or Black people are lazy.
Yes.
It's a way of changing, again, the ideological rhetoric in a way that makes it more palatable for people to be able to buy into the programs of white supremacy, in this case, without having to say, I'm a racist.
Which probably speaks to a lot of the pivot that DEIA has. I know Paul was saying earlier that was not the kind of terminology that was present during his maturation in the 1960s, right?
Yes.
And it is, in my view, you both may disagree about this, but it is, in my view, a truly criminal failure on the part of the left. And I'm going to say the Democratic Party, although I don't really think that they're left, but whatever, they're the only left that we have officially. But it is a truly criminal failure on the part of the Democratic Party to have not made more of an effort to clearly articulate what DEIA is and why it's necessary. These are not hard arguments to make. I mean, we're literally sitting in a hotel bar making them. These are not hard things to explain to people.
Have we succeeded in making arguments for DEIA? I'm not trashing it. I'm simply asking the question because I wanted to come back to what activism is. Because I think in a lot of ways, you, Leigh, have categorized a particular form of rightist activism that has gotten traction. And I think that is contrasted to the activism that we're thinking with Paul about, namely the mobilizations and movement that he was engaged in. Enjoying the conversation? Let's connect. Whether you're in the mood for a spicy debate or just want to say hi, we're all over the internet. Find us on Facebook at Hotel Bar Sessions Podcast, on Twitter and Blue Sky at Hotel Bar Podcast, and catch our latest videos on YouTube and TikTok at Hotel Bar Sessions. Want even more? Our website, hotelbarpodcast.com, is your one-stop shop for all things Hotel Bar Sessions. Follow us, tag us, and join the fun.
Paul, if you were advising a new generation of activists today, what historical lessons would you want them to take most seriously?
Leigh, it seems to me that an activism that I'm hoping against hope will emerge from the mess of MAGA. One of its central attributes will be the capacity to listen, which almost no left-wing organization or party and a lot of politicians and people don't do it. What we're lacking today is listeners. So one of the things I'm finding is that listening to you two speak is tremendously edifying for me. Precisely because of the age difference. That is, you're not aware of it, but I could tabulate what it consists of. I'm learning a lot from both of you. So that may be why when you start talking, I'm not thinking, oh, I want to tell what I think. It's rather, I want to hear what you guys think because you're really perceptive, both of you. My form of activism today and for the last decade or so is that I pick up trash in my neighborhood. That's a major thing that I do. The neighborhood happens to be predominantly Black. There's Africans and Afro-Cubans and Haitians and African Americans. So a friend of mine sent me a hoodie and he had printed on it, "White Trash Collective."
I wish you were picking up more white trash.
Well, I live next door to a gay couple and I showed this to Rob and Bob. And Rob says, "Honey, I've been collecting white trash for decades." So what irritates me about historically the left, and I think a lot of things you've been saying, Leigh, I connect to very strongly. I think your perceptions of the left and its failures is right on target, is the absence of a capacity to listen. One of the things that I was drawn to in Karl Marx's writing was his incapacity to listen. I loved it. He said what he thought, and he was right. So no wonder there was Stalin. From an intellectual standpoint, there seems to be a connection with a sensibility. And this is also one of the great ironies. Here I am babbling on about the importance of listening. So I'll stop.
No,
I'll stop
no.
babbling.
Well, we're also here to listen to you.
My fantasy is that there will be people who have not been politically engaged before, who will be politicized in a good and creative way by this mess that we're in.
Yeah.
I mean, who will begin to say, we can't keep doing, what's the point of doing that? What are we afraid of? My dignity will be sacrificed if I do what you want me to do, so I'm not going to do it. I quit.
Yeah.
That has an integrity to me, even if someone could say, yes, but commodity capitalism is partly what's going on. That's the thing that Devonya and Leigh were talking about, that corporations are not distressed by a certain type of DEIA. We can tolerate that. We can have that. We can celebrate it. Then if the president tells us to stop it, we stop it.
Mm-hmm.
I developed an allergy over the decades to left-wing self-certainty. And I still situate myself on the left.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say you situate yourself on the, or for anyone to say they situate themselves on the left in the United States, because the left on the United States is still quite moderate or even right-wing, globally speaking. But I do want to just pick up on something that you said, which is that there's a kind of quitting. I'm not sure that's the exact words you use, but like, I'm just not going to participate. That is also a form of activism. And I agree with you. I think that's right. As long as it's conscientious and intentional, borrowing the language of Frantz Fanon, there's a lot of refusing that needs to be done as activism. However, I'm a little bit worried that there's a lot of quitting that is more exhaustion, more apathy, more disillusionment. And that worries me. And I hear a lot of people, especially my students, say things like, I just don't watch the news. Can't take it anymore. It's just too much. This horrifies me in a way, because I feel like you need to stay plugged in to things. I mean, even if it's just to keep your teeth sharp, like I sharpen my teeth every morning on whatever crazy news story comes out about Elon Musk or Donald Trump or Anthropic or Boeing or whatever. I mean, you have to stay plugged in. And I'm not sure that we shouldn't maybe encourage a little bit more anger and a little less hope. I want people to be pissed off. I think people are not pissed off enough.
Vanya, you turned me on to a book by a Black woman writer called something like The Purpose of Rage or The Purpose of Anger. It was exactly what you're saying, Leigh. So I'm kind of amused, but I guess I sort of stumbled, partly walking backward, into being the one who's optimistic.
It's okay to be optimistic, but you can be angry and optimistic at the same time.
Yes, I mean the one who's hopeful, because I don't feel a whole lot of hope. I pick up trash because my main experience is of despair.
Yeah.
At least I can keep the streets relatively clean. I don't have to worry about an organization.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is one of the things in listening to you talk about the way you were invited into a community that was organized around a set of goals that generated a certain kind of hospitality in the interests of collectively moving toward those goals at great risk. And I feel that some of the despair, some of the fatigue has a lot to do with the ways in which we're disconnected, that we are not engaged in collectivities. And I'm not downing the internet. I'm not downing social media. But I am wondering if there's a difference in terms of the immediacy of looking someone in the face, of engaging them, and having to respond and negotiate where those differences are, that it does require that kind of radical listening that I think Paul was alluding to earlier.
Yeah.
For sure.
And I don't know what kind of activism emerges from that. Like, I feel in some ways I'm coming off as being down on DEIA, but I thought with the first Trump election that some of the slippage in terms of what Paul has called the left self-certainty would come to the fore in ways that prompted people to be mobilized, that allowed them to see things. And I remember saying to a number of my white friends, I hear that you're upset about Trump, but you're really having the experience of disenfranchisement that Black Americans or people who have been dispossessed from their land are having in this election. And this is a shocking experience for you, but it's an opportunity for a kind of realization.
Yes.
And the moment passed.
Yeah.
And I think there have been a number of those. So I think I despair about the capacity to hear in a deep way and to hear in ways that attune us to creative ways we need to be politicized.
Hey there, barflies. We don't often say stop listening, but I'm asking you to press pause right now on this episode and help us out. If you haven't already done so, go to hotelbarsessions.patreon.com to support this podcast. It's easy, it's cheap, we have several levels of sponsorship available, and for less than the cost of a round of drinks per month, you could help us cover our production costs and keep serving up these straight shots of wisdom every week. Not ready to commit to a Patreon sponsorship just yet? No worries. You can still support the podcast by visiting our website at hotelbarpodcast.com. Click on the Support Us page, where you can make one-time donations via PayPal, Cash App, and Venmo. While you've got us on pause, double-check that you're following Hotel Bar Sessions on social media. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Share our posts with your friends and let us know what you think about each new episode. We honestly never expected this podcast to grow as much or as fast as it did. But thank you all for listening. Please consider throwing a few bucks in our tip jar. Paul, I've been kind of wanting to ask you this the whole time that we've been sitting here, but if you were younger, if you were a sophomore in college again today, what would you be doing?
Once again, you've asked a very, very fine question. I would hope, I probably wouldn't do what I'm hoping I would have done, but I hope that I would have, if I were 20 now, college sophomore, 21, I would try to figure out how to develop an opposition to Trump that moves past him and on the way is even more entertaining than he is. Because the Democratic Party, what it revealed in this last election, is it just doesn't know how to put on a show. Trump, in certain ways, is a genius of mass manipulation. He just has said, screw it to all the rules.
Yeah.
People admire him for his cruelty and for his candor about his cruelty. The left needs to have something outside of the familiar political categories, outside of familiar ways. A friend of mine is working on an article on things that Trump has drawn from the left. For example, what he learned from the work of the Yippies, Abby Hoffman, and the disruption of the Chicago 8 trial as turning politics into a spectacle. I mean, Trump went much further. He had an insurrection, but it was a spectacle. It was not in the halls of Congress. It was in this other place of uncertainty. So I would hope to be that kid who was working on that. And meanwhile, I would go to pro-Palestinian campus demonstrations as a non-Zionist Jew. And I'd ask to be accepted as a non-Zionist, not an anti-Zionist. Somebody who's simply without Zionism. It never meant shit to me. But I try to listen and I understand how distressed Jews are. And I'd like to talk about that with the campus left, with whom I agree and have some issues to discuss with them. So that's what I do if I were 20. But outside of those encampments, I would try to figure out how to use popular culture, how to use something. There's a lot of boring political currents around.
It sounds to me pretty much like you'd be a TikTok creator is what you'd be. There's a lot of really good young people on TikTok, truly leftist young people that are disruptive, that are entertaining, and that, in my view, are probably making way more of a difference than all the members of the Democratic National Committee combined.
Just for the record, Leigh, I agree with you about that. And if there's any uncertainty about the following, when I speak of the left, I'm not talking about the Democratic Party.
Oh, yeah, I know. I think we're all on the same page there.
Some of the squad would be part of what I call the left. I have other reservations about Biden and the Democratic Party moderates. But
Yeah.
Noted, for the record.
I was reading an article last night featuring Mark Cuban, who said the Democrats cannot sell. And Paul's comments made me think about that in fact, part of selling is creating the spectacle.
And the good thing about the opposition to come is that I'll be in it with you guys.
Yeah, love that. Well, unfortunately, we are getting last call from our bartender, which means that we have to bring this conversation to a close. I just want to say again, Paul, this has been such an absolutely great conversation. I cannot possibly thank you enough for sitting down, talking with us, sharing with us your experiences and your hope. I wasn't trying to make fun of your hope before.
You didn't. Thank you both for having me. And it's a challenge and a huge honor to speak as someone who is part of the Freedom Rides, to keep that alive.
Yeah, and it's something I did not know about you when I was in graduate school and we were working together. This is kind of a recent awareness of your background, and so I like to think that sensibility seeped in and shaped me as a graduate student and a professor. So thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you, thank you. I'll pray for you when you edit, Leigh.
Bye, guys.
Bye.